Again, welcome everyone. My name is Tia Gamble. I'm from Cloud Academy. You guys might have noticed all the emails I've sent you recently, but I'm so excited that you're here to join us about learning more about how to obtain the Microsoft Solutions Architect Expert certification by passing the Azure 305 exam. I see a lot of people still coming in. Welcome, welcome. Before I hand it over to Guy, I just want to note a couple of housekeeping rules. As usual, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you via email at the conclusion of this webinar. We hope that you stay a little bit after because we will be having a Q&A session, so you'll be able to ask your questions directly to Guy. With that being said, during Guy's presentation, I highly recommend that if you have a question, just go ahead and pop it into the chat or the question box. And at the end, he'll be able to answer everyone's question at that time. So without further ado, I'm going to let Guy take over. And again, thank you all for being here.
I'm Guy Hummel, and I'm the Azure Content Director at Cloud Academy. We're going to start off with some details about the AZ-305 exam. Then we'll spend the majority of the time in this webinar on sample questions. Then I'll give you a few exam tips, both for preparing for the exam and also for taking the exam. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. Okay, the exam details. First of all, there are no prerequisites. So even though you have to pass both the AZ-104 exam and the AZ-305 exam in order to get the Azure Solutions Architect Expert certification, you don't actually have to pass the AZ-104 exam first before you take this exam. You can take them in whichever order you want. All right, it's about 2 hours long. Number of questions, somewhere between 40 and 60. It may vary a little bit. It's probably around 50 questions. Now for the types of questions, first of all, there are multiple choice, which you'd expect on this sort of exam. And if you've taken any AWS exams or GCP exams, then this is mostly what you're going to get on those exams. But with Microsoft, they have quite a variety of different question types. They're much different that way. And so they do have multiple choice questions, but they also have things like what I'm calling true false with repeated scenario. And they seem to really like these ones. Ever since they introduced them, I now see them on every exam that they have, and they normally have them at the very beginning of the exam. So you start off with relatively simple scenario where they're asking you to come up with a solution, and then they propose a solution and they ask you, will this solution work for this scenario? And then you just say yes or no. And then you move on to the next question. The next question gives you the same scenario again with a different solution and asks you if this solution will work. And so it might seem at first like these are easy questions because they're basically true-false questions, which, is easier than having to choose between 4 different answers. But these are actually trickier than they look. So the trickiest thing about them is that you can't go back to a previous question. When you answer the first time and you think, yeah, this solution looks like it would work, so you say yes, and then you go to the next question, they give you a slightly different solution and you realize, oh, that first solution actually wouldn't have worked. It was missing something, but it doesn't let you go back and change your answer. So that makes it a little tougher. There are always 3 of them. So you go on to the third question and it's the same scenario again, different solution, and yes or no again. So I actually find these to be a little bit tricky. They also have drag and drop. They have different kinds of these, but a typical example would be where you would have, let's say, 4 services on the left-hand side, and then 4 descriptions of those services on the right-hand side, and you need to match them up. So you need to drag the service to the appropriate description. They have other drag and drop ones like that too, but that's the idea. Okay, then they also have drop-down menus. This is kind of similar to the drag and drop, except that the way this works is they'll have some kind of a statement, and there will be 1 or 2 blanks in it, and you need to fill in those blanks by choosing from a drop-down menu of potential answers. Okay, then there's case studies. These ones take a lot more time typically. You are given a case study where you have to read a lot of information. So it'll be things like there'll be an overview, then there'll be, say, business requirements, technical requirements, security requirements, all that sort of thing. And it's quite a bit to read. And so then they give you somewhere between, I would say, 4 and 8 questions typically on that same case study. And so it's kind of like the true false with repeated scenario, except that the scenario is much more detailed. And also these aren't true false questions. They could be any of the other question types. Quite often these case studies will come at the end of the exam. And since they do typically take longer to go through, you need to make sure that you have enough time at the end to handle case studies. There could be other types of questions as well. Microsoft does come up with new ones occasionally. They used to have live lab questions. I don't know if questions is the right word for that, where you would actually go into an Azure portal and would have to perform a task. They typically have maybe even as many as a dozen tasks you needed to perform, which is sort of like having 12 separate questions. They used to have these in quite a few exams, but they stopped including them a while ago, and I don't know if they're going to bring them back or not, but they just might. All right, moving on to what the topics are on the exam. So there are 4 sections in the exam guide. The first is design identity, governance, and monitoring solutions. Then there's design data storage solutions, design business continuity solutions, and design infrastructure solutions. Now I'll go through each one of these 4 sections in a little bit more detail. So for identity, governance, and monitoring, I'll just go through what the key services are that you need to know for this section. And I'm not including all of the services that you need to know, but these are kind of the important ones. The most important one by far is Azure Active Directory. It's a very complex service. It has a lot of features and components within it, so there's a ton that you need to know about Azure Active Directory. It's similar to Microsoft's on-premises Active Directory solution, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it is a little bit different too. All right, so Active Directory is for authentication. It's for identity, making sure that people who are logging in are who they say they are. Role-based access control, or RBAC, deals with authorization. So in other words, once someone has logged in and you know that it's the right person who's logged in, then you need to know what they're able to do. What permissions do they have? Then there's Azure Monitor, which can monitor virtually anything in your Azure infrastructure. Azure Network Watcher is a suite of tools to help you diagnose issues with networks. Azure Policy is where you can set governance policies saying what users are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. I know this sounds like role-based access control, but it's slightly different. It's saying things like people are not allowed to create databases anywhere outside of European regions, let's say, or something like that, where it's not about whether they can create databases or not. That's something that would be under RBAC. This is about specific things that are more policy related. And then there's Azure Key Vault, which is where you can store secrets and passwords and things like that. Okay, data storage solutions includes Azure Storage, which is really important. And again, this is a very complex service, has lots of subcomponents that you need to know. Azure SQL Database is the most popular relational database on Azure. It's very similar to SQL Server, but it isn't 100% compatible. If you need something that's 100% compatible, then SQL Managed Instance is a better choice. There's Azure Cosmos DB, which is Microsoft's NoSQL database. So it's much more scalable than SQL Database or SQL Managed Instance. Azure Databricks is an analytics solution where Microsoft is partnered with a company called Databricks. There's Synapse Analytics, which is Microsoft's newest analytics solution and the one that they're really trying to get everyone to use. Time Series Insights is sort of an older one. It's very specifically for analyzing time series data. Data Factory is something that's used for moving data around, between services, transforming data, that sort of thing. For business continuity solutions, Azure Site Recovery is really important. This lets you fail over from one environment to another, between on-premises and Azure, or between one Azure environment and another. Azure Backup is important for disaster recovery as well. And from the name, it sounds like it's something that you could use on pretty much any Azure service, kind of like how Azure Monitor can be used on virtually any Azure service. But Azure Backup is a bit different. It's focused on virtual machines. It can back up a few other things, but it's mostly virtual machines it's used for. So most Azure services include their own backup function that you can configure within that service. So it's not a separate service like Azure Backup. Thought I'd make that distinction. Azure Front Door is for distributing web traffic to different regions. Azure Traffic Manager is for directing other kinds of traffic or web traffic, whichever, to different regions. Now this slide, you'll see, has an awful lot of services on it. And on the previous slides, I didn't include all of the services you need to know or all the concepts you need to know for each of those sections. And that's the case here too, even though there are so many on this slide. I would say the Design Infrastructure Solutions section is fundamentally different from the other three sections. The idea here is that you need to know a whole bunch of services on Azure, what they do, how they work with each other. Mostly what they do. So you need to know the use case for them, their capabilities. You don't need to know them in great depth. You just need to have a really good idea of what they're used for, I would say. In some cases, you might need to know some of the features of them in a little bit more detail, but not a lot, really. Okay, so this includes things like virtual machines, app service, which is used to host web apps, Kubernetes service, which is for container orchestration, if you know what that is, Azure Functions, which is the main serverless offering, where you basically just upload bits of code and let Azure figure out how to host them. Logic apps, where you can set up automated tasks without having to know how to code. Azure Migrate, for migrating from your on-premises environment to Azure. Import-export is related to that as well. Azure Express Route, for having a dedicated connection between your on-premises environment and Azure. Load Balancer, for distributing traffic among different virtual machines that are all hosting the same application. Application Gateway is similar, but it's specifically for web apps. Virtual WAN for wide area networks. Azure Firewall. Azure Automation. Service Bus, which is for messaging between software components. API management for hosting application programming interfaces for your applications, and many others. But I would say you should at the very least know these ones. Now, out of all of those, for all four sections, I would say the most important services to know are Azure Active Directory, which, as I mentioned before, has just a ton of capabilities and lots of things to know about it. Azure Storage, kind of similar, maybe not quite as much as Azure Active Directory, but still lots of things you need to know there. And Azure SQL Database. Those are the three where I would say you're likely to get multiple questions on them. I would say at least 3 each, probably more than that. So you definitely need to know these quite well. And the other thing is that even in some of the other sections, so for example, Azure Storage is something you need to know for the second section, which is storage solutions, but it's also needed in other sections, like in the business continuity section, you need to know how Azure Storage fits in there. For example, and SQL Database is the same way. You need to know how to set up high availability and disaster recovery for SQL Database. So even though I didn't list SQL Database on that page about business continuity, it is something you need to know for business continuity. So anyway, these are the 3 I would say that you need to know in quite a bit of depth. All right, on to the sample questions. Number 1, you use Azure Active Directory to control access to Azure. You discover 2 issues that need to be addressed. Many employees who have moved to different teams still have access to Azure resources that they should no longer have access to. Employees who occasionally need to perform administrator level tasks have those permissions all the time instead of requesting access only when needed. Which single feature of Azure Active Directory should you implement to address both of these security issues? All right, the first one is conditional access, which sounds like it's at least related to what we're trying to do here. But conditional access is how you set up things like only allowing people to be able to log in if they're on the corporate network, or if they're coming from particular devices or things like that. So that doesn't really address these two issues that we're talking about here. Identity protection sounds like it might be a good possible answer. But what this one is specifically for is it analyzes login activity and it tries to determine which ones might be hackers trying to get in and flags those so that you can deal with them. So that's not what we're trying to do here. Multi-factor authentication is where you require everyone to log in with a password and also use another authentication method, which is usually that you'd send an access code to their phone and they have to enter that code. So again, not what we need here. And then privileged identity management has a whole bunch of capabilities. And one of its capabilities is that it can set up access reviews where it sends out requests to different managers and asks those managers, do these people still need to have this type of access? Which is what we need for number one of employees being moved to different teams and then not having their access revoked. It also lets you have something called just-in-time access, which is where someone can request administrator level access. And if it's granted, then they have that access only for a relatively short period of time, and then it goes away, which would address the second thing that we're trying to do here. So privileged identity management is the one that we need. Now, if you had to guess, if you didn't actually know what all of these things did, you might be able to figure it out by looking at the names. I mean, it'd still be a little bit tricky, but privileged identity management does at least sound like something that you could use to handle administrator level privileges. It would still be a guess, but if you look at the names of these things, you can sometimes sort of figure out what they might do. All right, question number 2. You need to choose a relational database on Azure that meets these requirements. It can support 2 terabytes of data. It guarantees 99.99% availability. It can be paused to reduce costs during idle times. And it supports auto-scaling. So now there are 2 questions down here. One is, which Azure service should you choose? And the other is, which service and compute tiers should you choose? So you really need to know your relational databases on Azure to be able to answer this question. All right, for the first question, is it SQL Managed Instance, SQL Database, SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine, or Azure Database for MySQL? There's one key requirement that tells you which one of these is the right answer. It's the third one, can be paused to reduce costs during idle times. Right? The only one that can do that is SQL Database. Now we should also look at the other requirements and make sure that it meets those requirements. Can it support 2 terabytes of data? Yes, it can. Guarantees 99.99% availability? Yes. Supports auto-scaling. With certain configurations, it can support auto-scaling. All right, so let's move on to the second question. Which service and compute tiers should you choose? So this looks rather complicated, right? If you look at the first part of each answer, we've got business critical, hyperscale, and general purpose. And hyperscale is repeated again. It's often a good idea to look at the answers in this way, where you sort of break down what are the different pieces of it and what's the same and what's different between the different answers. On the right-hand side, we've got just 2 choices. It's either provisioned or serverless. And those are repeated again. Now, going back to that key requirement that it can be paused to reduce costs during idle times, that capability is only there if you're using serverless, the serverless compute tier. If you use provisioned, the way it works is that you provision the resources needed for the database, and those stay up all the time. With serverless, you can go up and down, and it's much more flexible that way. So that immediately tells us that it's either B or C, because those are the two that have serverless at the end. The question is, do we want hyperscale or general purpose for the service tier? So in this case, there's something that you absolutely need to know. I don't think you could guess this one. And that's that the serverless option is not supported under hyperscale. It's only supported under general purpose. And so C is the correct answer. We should still look back at the requirements again and make sure that this configuration works for all the requirements. And, as I've said, for the third one, it's definitely true. For the first two, those are true for all of the configurations that you can have under SQL database. The fourth one supports autoscaling. That's only available for certain configurations, but one of those configurations is serverless. So this does meet the requirements. Question number 3. You need to store a large number of documents in Azure storage. The solution should meet these requirements while minimizing costs. And that while minimizing costs is important. In a lot of questions, they'll say something like that. And so that means, usually, that there are multiple answers that could be right, but there's only one that has the minimum cost and still meets the requirements. So keep that in mind. Documents will be accessed infrequently. When documents are accessed, they need to be retrieved quickly. Files need to be available even if an entire Azure region goes down. So there are 2 questions. Which storage type should you choose? And which access tier and redundancy should you choose? For the storage type, we have table, blob, file, disk, and queue. So if you know very much about the different types of storage that are available in Azure Storage, this is a pretty easy question. But there is still a little bit of a tricky part to it. So first of all, we're going to eliminate table, which is sort of like a NoSQL option under Azure Storage. So it's very different from what we need here. Disk is for disks that are attached to virtual machines. Queue storage is something for messaging between software components, so definitely not what we need here. So that leaves blob and file. You might think, based on the question, especially considering it's talking about files in the third requirement, that file would be the right answer. But blobs and files are actually similar. Blobs are stored as files. So really blob storage is file storage. So what's the difference between blob storage and file storage? Well, file storage is meant to be for network file shares. So if on Windows you needed to map a drive letter to a network drive, you could do that with Azure Files. Blob storage is different because it's not a hierarchical storage solution. That means you don't have a tree of folders and files, folders and subfolders and all that sort of thing. Blob storage is just flat storage. It's just sort of this random collection of files. And it also doesn't support the network file sharing that Azure Files does. And the really key thing for this question is that file storage costs more than blob storage. And so since part of the question is that we're minimizing costs, then blob storage is the correct answer. Because file storage would work. It's just that it's more expensive. Now, on to the second question. Which access tier and redundancy should you choose? So, similar to the last question, we have 2 parts to each answer. So on the left-hand side, we've got it's either cool, hot, or archive for the access tier. And on the right side, we've got GRS, GZRS, ZRS, and LRS. And if you don't know what those acronyms stand for, then you're going to be in real trouble on this question. So I'm going to show you what they stand for. GRS is geo-redundant storage. What this means is the files are replicated in multiple regions. So that means even if an entire region goes down, the files will still be available. And that's what the third requirement is. It needs to be able to handle that case. GZRS is geo-zone redundant storage. And that also copies files across different regions. But it also copies them across different zones within the region. So it's even more redundant than GRS. However, it does cost more than GRS does for obvious reasons because there are more copies. And so for this question, we're trying to minimize costs. So of those two, geo-redundant storage is the better option. Zone redundant storage is where it has copies of your files in multiple zones within a region. So if the entire region goes down, you won't have access to those files, so that doesn't meet the requirement. Locally redundant storage is where there are multiple copies within one data center. So if a data center goes down, then you won't have access to those files. So it's worse than zone redundant storage. So the correct answer is geo-redundant storage. However, we have two answers here, A and C, that both have geo-redundant storage. So let's go back to the left-hand side. Is it cool or hot that we need? The second requirement, which is when documents are accessed, they need to be retrieved quickly, would suggest that maybe we want hot storage. However, the first requirement, documents will be accessed infrequently, suggests that maybe we need to use cool storage. So one thing you need to know is that cool storage gets retrieved just as quickly as hot storage does. So the second requirement is fine for both of them. But if the files are going to be accessed infrequently and we're trying to minimize costs, then we should use cool storage, not hot storage, because cool storage is cheaper, as long as you're accessing infrequently. So the answer is A, cool and GRS. So there's quite a bit to know in this question, but assuming you know what each of these terms means, then you can break things down and come up with the right answer without too much trouble. Question number 4. You need to deploy a web application that lets users store and edit text files. You'd like to use Cosmos DB for storage, but you have these requirements. The database should be distributed across multiple regions. A user should only see the latest version of each document, and latency should be minimized. What consistency level should you choose? Strong, bounded staleness, session, consistent prefix, or eventual. Now, if you don't know anything about consistency levels in Cosmos DB, this will look like Greek to you. Like bounded staleness? What the heck is that? So you definitely would need to know these kinds of details about Cosmos DB to be able to answer this question. And I've actually arranged the answers in a particular order, which won't necessarily be the case on the real exam, but just to make it easier to explain here. So strong consistency is the strongest, as you'd expect, consistency, but it has the highest latency. And the third requirement is that latency should be minimized. So right there, this is looking like maybe this isn't going to be the right answer. The one at the bottom, eventual, has the weakest consistency, but the lowest latency. So at least it meets the latency requirement. So what is consistency exactly? What is it we're trying to do here? Well, consistency says after some data is written to the database, and then someone tries to read that data, will they get the latest version of that data? Now, if you don't know anything about NoSQL databases, you might think, well, of course they're going to get the latest data that was written there. And that would be the case for a relational database. But in a NoSQL database, because it's very scalable, it could even be distributed across different regions around the world. And you could even have writes going on in different regions at the same time. It's very hard to coordinate all of that. And so this is where consistency becomes important. Because if a piece of data is written in one location and it doesn't get updated in another location for a while, and someone tries to read it in that other location, which version of the data are they going to get? The advantages you get with NoSQL databases like Cosmos DB of being able to scale so much. There are disadvantages to that too, which is this consistency problem. And that's why there are 5 different levels of consistency. So with eventual consistency, it says eventually it'll be consistent. Eventually you'll get the right version, but it might take a while. So, that's not very promising for what we're trying to do here. Because the second requirement is that a user should only see the latest version of each document. So really what we're saying here is that when data gets written to the database and someone goes to read that data, they should get the latest version of that data, right? Which is not something that they're going to get if they use eventual consistency. All right, so consistent prefix means that the data will be in order. That is, you'll never have the situation where you read a piece of data and it's the newest one, let's say, and then a little while later you read it again and it's an older version, right? So it's out of order. That should never happen. And if you use consistent prefix, it won't happen. If you use eventual, that could happen, which sounds really weird, but that's the way it works. Okay, so consistent prefix sounds good, but it doesn't guarantee that we get the latest version. Bounded staleness says that you might not get the latest version, but there's a limit to how old it's going to be. Okay, so still that doesn't meet our requirements for this. With session consistency, you get strong consistency for each individual session, and you have low latency. So what this means, the first part of this, is that if you have an application where each user has a session, they're writing to the database and they're reading their own writes, then everything's consistent. They have strong consistency. So they'll always get the latest version. So this works really well for an application like we're talking about here, where you don't have sharing between different users. They're not reading each other's documents. They're just doing their own thing. Session consistency works really well. And in fact, it's the default for Cosmos DB, and it's the most commonly used. So that's the one we want here. Question number 5. Your company has 2 on-premises single VM-based applications that it would like to fail over to Azure virtual machines in the event of a disaster. Application A doesn't include a database, but application B does. They have the following requirements. Application A requires a minimal RPO. Application B requires a minimum RTO. So let's stop just for a second and talk about what those mean. RPO stands for Recovery Point Objective, which means when you're recovering from backups, at what point should you be recovering the data? Meaning, do you want the very latest data that was written to the backups, or do you want it from some earlier point, like, I don't know, yesterday or something like that? This is an important consideration. And sometimes you can get away with recovering backups from a previous time, and sometimes you really need the absolute latest backup. So when it says application A requires a minimal RPO, what they mean is it needs to be as close to the present time as possible. Application B requires a minimal RTO, which stands for Recovery Time Objective. And that refers to how long it takes for the backups to be recovered and for the system to come back up again. So if you want a minimal RTO, then that means you want it to come back up as soon as possible. These two things are actually in opposition with each other, because if you want the absolute latest backups, that takes longer than if you want backups from a previous time. And the reason for that, I'll explain in a second. Let's read the question here. You decide to use Azure Site Recovery. Which recovery point option would be ideal for application A? Now with Azure Site Recovery, the way it works is the backup data that it receives has to be processed before it can be recovered. So that means if you want the latest backup data, you're going to have to wait for it to be processed first before you can recover it. And that means it's going to take a while, which would mean you'd have a long RTO. But it means you'd have a short RPO because you'd get the absolute latest point for your backups. Now, latest is the default option for Azure Site Recovery, but you'd only want to use that if you could afford to be down for a while before you come back up again. Latest processed says that we're going to go back to the point in time where all the backups are processed, and so we can come back up quickly. So it has an earlier RPO, or recovery point, but it has a faster recovery time. Now these last two are more complicated. So there's latest multi-VM processed. Now this is where if you have an application that's on multiple VMs, you need to have the backups on those VMs synchronized so that when you come back up again, everything will be consistent between them. Now that's not the case here because the question says that these are single VM-based applications. The last one is latest application consistent. What's different about this one is that a backup of the memory is included. And this is particularly important if you have a database. Backups are normally just of the disks, the data that's on the disks. not the data that's in memory. But if you really want to make sure you get back to exactly where you were, then you need to back up the memory too. And that's what this last option is for. All right, so let's go back to the question. What are we trying to do here? The question is actually only asking about application A. So we can just ignore application B and its RTO. We only care about the RPO. We want a minimal RPO. In other words, we want the latest RPO possible. And so we should go with latest. The RTO is going to be slower, but the question didn't say that that was a problem, so we're fine. We don't have multiple VMs for that application. Also doesn't have a database, so we don't need the latest application consistent setting. So latest is the one we're going to go with. All right, moving on to exam tips. So preparing for the exam. Now, you know I'm going to say this. I'm a little bit biased because this is my learning path, but I would say go through Cloud Academy's AZ-305 exam preparation learning path. It has video-based courses, hands-on labs, and a practice exam. I'll point out though, if you go through this, don't skip the required reading for Microsoft AZ-305 exam document that I have in there. And this document is just a list of links to some of Microsoft's documentation for topics that weren't covered in the learning path. So these are not major things, they're just a few things here and there. So it's just to fill in the gaps of what's missing in the learning path. But I think it's important for you to know these things, so do go through those few bits and pieces. You should also get a high percentage on our AZ-305 practice exam. And I will say that even if you do get a high percentage on it, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to pass the actual Microsoft exam. But at the very least, you should get a high percentage on this one before you take the real one. You should also review Microsoft's AZ-305 exam guide, look through all of the topics that are listed, and make sure you have a good understanding of each one of those. All right, now for taking the actual exam, check in at least 15 minutes before the start time. You may, in the email you get, it may say you need to come in 30 minutes before the start time, but at the very least, you should be there 15 minutes before. Manage your time in the exam. Since it's a 2-hour exam and there are about 50 questions, that means you have roughly 2 minutes per question. So keep that in mind as you're going through the exam to see whether you're ahead or behind. And also remember, as I mentioned, there's quite often a case study at the end, and you need to leave enough extra time for those questions. There's a countdown timer in the exam, which is really helpful, because let's say you've answered 10 questions, you look at the countdown timer, you should be at around 20 minutes, somewhere in there, just to see if you're on track. But don't get obsessed with the countdown timer. Don't look at it too often. It can be very distracting, so just look at it occasionally to see how you're doing. And you can mark a question for review if it's taking up too much of your time. So the way it works is when you get to the last question, after you're done that, it'll give you a page where you can go back to any of the questions and it'll show you which ones you've marked for review so you can get back to them immediately without having to go through a whole bunch of questions to get to it. So that's very helpful if you get stuck on a question and you need to move on. However, as I mentioned before, you can't go back on some questions, particularly those true-false with repeated scenario questions. And sometimes once you've finished a particular section of an exam, it won't let you go back to the questions before that. So do keep that in mind. The approach that I take with the case studies is that I skim through them quickly so I get a gist of what's in there and what's in each section. Then I go to the first question and I see which parts of the case study are most important for this question, and I go back and read those parts in more detail. Because generally, a question isn't asking you about the entire case study, it's just asking you about particular sections. But you should still skim the whole case study beforehand, because you never know, there might be something in another section that's relevant. So just give yourself a general idea of what's in there, then go back to the particular sections that matter for the question. Now, for remote exams, so there are two ways you can take the exam, right? You can either go to a testing center, or you can do it remotely from your home or from your office. And from my experience, it's actually much more stressful to do remote exams than to go to a testing center, which might seem counterintuitive at first because you think, well, doing it in your own home would be nice compared to having to go to this testing center. But the problem is that because the testing organization hasn't set up your home to be able to monitor you, they're much stricter about what you can do during the exam. They have to make sure that you're not cheating. And so that means there are all these rules that you actually don't have if you're in a testing center. For example, you need to look at the screen the entire time you're taking the exam. Because if you're looking away, they might think that you're cheating somehow. You're looking at some notes or whatever. And so I was in an exam once where I was most of the way through the exam, I was tired, and there was a hard question I was thinking about. So as I was thinking about it, I looked away from the screen for 5 seconds or something. And when I looked back at the screen, there was a message on there saying I'd been kicked out of the exam because I'd violated the rules, which freaked me out. And I managed to get a hold of technical support. They got me back into the exam again. They decided, they didn't think I was cheating because they reviewed the video, because they actually record you from the video camera on your laptop. So they reviewed that. They eventually got me back in, but it was half an hour before I got back in again. And now I was not only tired, but stressed out, and I still had to finish the exam. So it's not what you want to have to deal with. And there are lots of rules, right? Like you can't talk, which you might think would be easy to comply with, but sometimes you talk to yourself when you're reading a question. You might say, "Oh, come on," when you read a question, or like, "Oh, this is hard," or whatever. And or you just mumble to yourself or something. You're not supposed to do that. So anyway, I'm just warning you. If you do take it remotely, and I do still take exams remotely despite the experience I had, read the rules carefully and follow their instructions. Having said all that, do try to relax, because you don't have to get a perfect score. You just need to get a score of 700 out of 1,000, which sounds like 70%, but apparently not necessarily. Can be scaled depending on the exam, but it's probably around 70%. So you don't have to get a perfect score. And even if you don't pass, you can retake the exam. Yes, you do have to pay for it when you take it again, but assuming that you can afford that, it's not that big a deal. You can study some more, go back and retake the exam and pass it, hopefully. You can retake it multiple times too. It's just that the amount of time you have to wait in between your attempts gets longer as you go. And then there is a limit, like 5 times in 1 year. So, but taking the exam the first time is not do or die. You don't have to pass it that first time. So try to relax. All right, that's it. So let's go into the question and answer session. What questions do you have about the exam, or about any of the topics, or taking the exam, or anything like that?
Alrighty, so it looks like we've only had one question, and it is, Guy, do you guys have an exam for Azure 104?
Yes, we do. That's a pretty easy question.
Um, haven't had any other questions. One second, they're coming up. Okay.
Okay. Maybe while we're waiting, I can mention that the AZ-305 exam is new, and it used to be that you had to pass AZ-303 and AZ-304. And so in a way, they've collapsed it into one exam, into AZ-305. But actually, what they've mostly done is replaced AZ-303 with the AZ-104 exam. And so you do have to pass both of them. I think they must have figured out that having both AZ-104 and AZ-303, like there was too much overlap between those exams. So they just got rid of AZ-303 essentially.
Next question is, do they still ask questions about which tier you need for X feature or Y memory capacity?
They have them in the example exam and they require so much memorizing. Let me think. I don't think there's too much of that. They do occasionally ask you about tiers. Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that too much. Certainly not memory capacity. I don't think they ever ask a question like that on AZ-305. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just trying to think, like, it's possible that in, let's say in Azure Active Directory, there are some features like conditional access where you need to have a premium license in order to have those. And so they might ask you something like that, but those would be pretty rare. Okay, let's see. Is there negative marking? And I'm assuming what you mean by that is if you get a question wrong, will they actually take points away from your score? And no, they don't do that.
Nice.
Do you have any deep dives on some of the topics required? Yeah, I mean, that's basically what's in our learning path is we go into a fair bit of detail on some of the topics, both with the courses and with the hands-on labs. For some of the topics, we have hands-on labs. How many practice tests should we take? Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, take as many as you can, I guess would be my initial response to that. Practice questions really are one of the best ways to prepare for the exam. Once you've gone through the material and you have a pretty good idea of things, you definitely need to go through practice exams quite a bit. Let's see. Is AZ-305 still in beta? No, it's not. Came out of beta a while ago. I forget exactly when, but it was a while ago. What percent of, just click this out quick. What percent of database and serverless is in the exam? Database and serverless. Oh, those are two kind of specific things. Well, the database topics are mostly under the data storage solutions section, and that's 25 to 30% of the exam. But that also includes Azure Storage and Azure Data Factory, basically. So that's not quite right. And then serverless is, that would be much less of the exam. It would be in the compute solution subsection of infrastructure solutions. So yeah, I mean, you might have a question or two on that, but it's not a lot of the exam. Let's see. Would you say this is harder than taking the AZ-303 and AZ-304? No, I think they're pretty much the same. I don't think the difficulty level has changed much, really. What would be the certificate path before and after AZ-305? Well, I mean, you do need to get the AZ-104 exam in addition to AZ-305 in order to get the certification. You don't have to take AZ-104 ahead of time, like before AZ-305, but it's probably a good idea to do that one first. And as far as after, well, this is one of the only expert level certifications. There are only two at the moment for Azure. There's this solutions architect one, and then there's the DevOps one, AZ-400, which also requires a second exam. So after you get this certification, I would say it just depends on what you're interested in. I mean, if you wanted to get deeper into like, machine learning or AI or something like that, you could take one of those certifications. There are lots and lots of different certifications. So it just kind of comes down to interest at that point, or what you need for your job, more likely. Let's see. Boy, a lot of questions coming in. This is great. I don't think I'll get to them all, so I'll have to respond to some of them in email afterward. But let me see. Oh, what's the cost of AZ-305? Well, actually, it depends on which country you're in. I think in the US, if I remember right, it's $165. So it's going to be somewhere around there, but it does vary by country. So definitely look that up for your country. What was the prerequisite exam you mentioned earlier? That was AZ-104. As I said, it's not exactly a prerequisite, but you do need to get both in order to get the certification. Is it more difficult to pass comparing to, AWS Solutions Architect Professional? I haven't actually taken the Solutions Architect Professional exam. I did pass the Solutions Architect Associate exam quite a few years ago before I started getting into Azure. And my guess would be that it's a similar level of difficulty, but I'm not positive of that. I would definitely say it's not easier than on the AWS side. The Azure exams are quite difficult, actually. Let's see. How long would it take to prepare for the exam? Well, that, of course, really varies depending on what your background, like what your experience is. But I would say you're probably looking at something like, I don't know, 100 hours at least to prepare. And that's just, off the top of my head. It will probably vary quite a bit from person to person, but you do need to spend a substantial amount of time preparing for this exam. Even if you do have a lot of experience, I still recommend studying quite a bit for it. There are a lot of little details to remember across a really broad range of topic areas. Let's see. I didn't see Azure HD Insight in the data part. Was HD Insight removed? Yeah, I think it was actually. I should double check that, but I don't remember seeing anything about HD Insight. It's kind of been getting de-emphasized because it's sort of an old service, and Synapse Analytics has largely replaced it. Both that and Databricks are more important to know than HD Insight now. Let's see. How in depth does the exam go when it comes to Azure networking? For example, VNet peering with VPN gateway or traffic manager. It goes into a fair bit of detail. You don't need to know how to actually implement these things, but you do need to know, well, it's sort of, I guess it's a little bit fuzzy whether this is implementation or not. But like on Traffic Manager, for example, you would need to know the different options for how Traffic Manager routes traffic, like whether it's performance or weighted, or there's a bunch of different ones. And there's also you can have sort of a hierarchy of Traffic Manager plans or profiles, I guess they're called, where you have to know how those different profiles would interact with each other in the hierarchy. So, you do have to get into quite a bit of detail for some of those networking topics for sure. I took AZ-104 today, noticed most of the topics in AZ-305 are overlapping with AZ-104. What's the difference between the two? The difference is that AZ-104 is focused more on implementation and AZ-305 is focused more on design. And so, although a lot of the topics are the same, in AZ-305, you need to know more about how everything fits together. You probably do need to know more topics for AZ-305, but you don't need to know them as in depth, generally speaking, except for a few like maybe, Azure Active Directory and Azure Storage. So yeah, it's AZ-305 is more at the design level. Let's see. Does it cost more money for each exam retake? It costs the same amount each time you retake the exam. So if it's 165 the first time, it's 165 the second time. etc. And I think I mentioned you can only take it 5 times in 1 year, and the same exam, that is. And after the first, like every time you retake it, you have to wait longer in between retakes until eventually you have to wait. I forget what it is, like a month or something before you can take the 5th time. Let's see. Is Azure Lighthouse a part of the exam? I don't think so. I can't guarantee that, but I haven't seen that anywhere. Let's see. What types of jobs can I expect to work in once having achieved the AZ-305? Well, I will say it definitely helps to get the certification for sure when it comes to getting jobs or to, for getting promotions and things like that. But you can't just rely on the certification. You do need to have some experience as well. However, if you do have, a decent amount of experience and you have the certification, the sort of job that you would hope to get anyway is, is a cloud architect sort of job, a cloud architect, solutions architect. There are a lot of those jobs out there these days, but yeah, you are going to need some experience before you could land one of those, I would say. And I don't know that they really have sort of junior architect roles. Probably more the way it would go is you'd start off as more of a sysadmin type. And then once you've done that for a while, then maybe you could move up to cloud architect. Let's see. And we're getting pretty close to the end of time here, but are there specific dates for each exam? Are these booked online? Yeah, you schedule the exam online, and they'll only have so many openings for you. Sometimes they have tons of openings, and sometimes they're really busy, and you have to wait. You have to schedule it like a week or two in advance. But yeah, you can book it online, and there usually are lots of days and times available for that. Let's see.
All right, Guy. We are at the end of our time today. So
Okay.
Thank you, Guy, so much for the wisdom and answering all the questions. There were a few questions that Guy wasn't able to get to, but he will follow up in an email and answer to the best of his ability. I know there were some specific questions regarding the exam, but we're sure we can point you in the right direction itself. So like I said at the beginning, this webinar was recorded and it will be shared with everyone today, and those that have also registered but weren't able to attend the entirety of the webinar. It will be sent to you when it's available, which will be about a day or two via email. At the end, there will be a survey that pops up, and we really appreciate any feedback that you have. It helps us to have better webinars and keep providing content that you guys appreciate and want to learn more about. So that is pretty much the end. That concludes our webinar. Hope that everyone has a wonderful day or evening, depending on where you are in the world, and we hope to see you soon.